everyone. Welcome to the first ever Flyers edition of Inquirer Live at Gameday Central. My name is Jackie Spiegel. I am the Flyers beat reporter. Joining us today, our first ever guest is Chris Peters, content manager, draft analyst, guru of FloHockey. Joining us all the way from beautiful Abbotsford, British Columbia. Chris, thank you so much for getting up early. I know it's early out there on the West Coast. I appreciate you for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure, Jackie. It's a lot of fun to join you. It's finally here, the draft. So honored to be your first guest, and hopefully we can provide some insight to Flyers fans today.
Appreciate it. All right, let's start big picture with the draft. There's been a lot of chatter about this year's draft class being weak. Do you feel that there's actually more strength in there than we originally thought?
I think there's always, when we talk about like a draft being stronger, deeper, or weaker, there's always going to be players that rise to the top, over time. Like really, I always say it, we can't judge drafts in the moment, and really even in the first couple of years, it takes a long time to really decide. So all we can say is what we see right now. What we see right now is a class, especially when you compare it to the last couple, that is weaker. There are more players with bigger questions that will probably go in the first round this year than there normally would be in other years. When you're picking in the first round, you're going a lot of times you're going based on the probabilities of that player becoming an NHL player. And I think we're going to see a lot of players that go in this draft in the first round that have a lower probability than guys that you would see go in the 16, 17, 18, range and beyond this year. So, and I think the other thing too is when you look at the top of this draft, we're talking about Matthew Schaefer as being the projected number one guy, yet he only played 17 games this year. I think that's kind of an indictment of the rest of the class that this guy in this small sample impressed that much that we're going to put him as number one in a year where there just really isn't a lot of precedent for a player that played that little going number one. Yet it seems like we all agree, based on what we've seen, that he is the best player available. So I think that's kind of when you look at this class, yes, in the moment right now, it does look weak, but there's always value that rises to the top later on. So I do think that we'll find more players that maybe we weren't expecting to be better. And so, some scouting staffs will feel pretty confident that they know who those guys are. But in most cases, and that even the scouts will tell you, it's really a crapshoot, and you just kind of have to wait and see. So I will be doing a lot of waiting and a lot of seeing with this draft class.
I think even just last night was a good example of that with Sam Bennett, right? When he was drafted number 4 overall by the Calgary Flames, he was expected to be a lot better at the moment, but it obviously took him a lot of time to develop his game. I mean, he's maybe a good example of what this draft class might be, that it's going to take a little bit more time than like a Macklin Celebrini or a Connor Bedard who steps into the role immediately.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there are always going to be late bloomers. There are guys that get given up on too soon. And I don't think that Sam Bennett was ever given up on.
Hold on 1 second, Chris. Sorry. I just realized we're not airing this till next week, and I just said last night. So maybe can we pick up there, Angelica, please? I'll re-ask the question.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want me to count down again, Angelica, or just go into it? Okay. I love this little chat thing. Also, I need to make this bigger because I am blind as a freaking bat. Sorry, give me 1 sec. I just want to make sure, because we're doing it next week, so I don't want it to sound dated.
Yeah,
when we do
for sure.
Right. Let me think. Okay. So Chris, is Sam Bennett? We saw it recently in the Stanley Cup Finals. Sam Bennett's the kind of guy, when he was drafted number 4 overall by the Calgary Flames, he was expected to kind of be a step into the role kind of guy, but it's obviously taking him a few years to develop his game. Is that something we're going to see this year? Because maybe there isn't a Macklin Celebrini or a Connor Bedard who will immediately join the NHL.
Yeah, I mean, I think to a certain extent, yes, there's going to be players like that. I think that, Sam Bennett's ultimate glow up as a NHL player happened after moving to Florida. And I think that that's an important thing too, is when players arrive at whatever team they're at, the situation matters. Now, when Sam Bennett was playing for Calgary, he was a guy that, obviously they had high hopes for in terms of being a top of the lineup player. And I think that there was probably an expectation that he was going to score more. He had 91 points in his draft year, so he was a guy that I think a lot of people were very confident in would be a producer at the NHL level because, and then on top of that, he still had that abrasive style that we see today. What happens with a player like a Sam Bennett is as they get into a different situation where they're allowed to kind of flourish a little bit more. And that's not to say that those opportunities didn't exist in Calgary. It's just that they existed in a more meaningful way in Florida. So yeah, you do have to wait and see in a lot of these cases. And there will be plenty of players in this draft that have better years for teams that did not pick them, after trades and everything else, just because as situations change, some players are going to be better suited for that new situation. Sam Reinhart is the same way. Buffalo, he was a good player, but he's a great player in Florida. And right. and Sam Reinhart is such a good example of, situation dictating success. And unfortunately for the Buffalo Sabres, it has been many years now of players leaving Buffalo and being in a better position to succeed. That's a huge problem they'll have to solve over time, but that's not always solved in the draft. There's a lot of different ways to solve that problem. They just haven't figured it out yet.
And as we've seen in the 2023 draft, how many of those guys been traded already from that top of the draft class? Oh, it happens. How many players, out of this class that we see now, how many players are you confident maybe could be NHL All-Star types?
I think NHL All-Star types, it's pretty limited. I think, we're talking about when we look at the top of this draft, I feel pretty confident in, the first, 5-6 players of being, maybe 7 players being that caliber of player. Like, I think that they'll be impact NHL players. Maybe they make an all-star team. Maybe they play in an all-star game or something like that. But really, it's hard to predict that because I think based on what we've seen in this class, sometimes you get sucked into the relativity of the class where it's like, okay, Caleb Desnoyers relative to the class is an exceptional player, within the mix of James Higgins, Michael Misa, Matthew Schaefer, Jake O'Brien, like that. We keep talking about those guys. I think the talent significantly drains after 13. I think 13 is kind of where it starts to go further and further down. I think you have guys that can be top of the lineup players within that first 12 to 13 picks. More than likely, a lot of them will be second line guys. And so I think that that's something that you'll kind of see over time, but there are so few sure things in this draft. And I think that even happens with even Matthew Schaefer, where we just haven't seen enough of him to be able to confidently say he is going to be a superstar NHL player. I do think that this draft has great potential for the best player not being the first overall pick. Wow. Which, you think about Nico Hischier, Nolan Patrick, that draft, who went after them, Miro Heiskanen, Cale Makar. Like, I think that there's the possibility, that possibility exists, even though I think based on what I've seen over the course of this season, Matthew Schaefer has the best potential to be a superstar NHL player.
Well, we don't mention Nolan Patrick around Philly these days.
Yeah, so. I know. I did it trepidatiously, but I had to do it for context.
Absolutely. All right. And who have you been most impressed with in this draft class?
In terms of impressed by, I think there's. It's tough to say. There haven't been a lot of guys that have gotten me really excited, about the draft. But I still am a big James Higgins believer. I think that the thing that he had 35 points in college this year, and Macklin Celebrini had much more than that last year, and the year before that, Adam Fantilli had much more than that. And so, when you see players like that, you say, well, that James Higgins disappointed, but he had more points than Brady Tkachuk did as a freshman. And Brady Tkachuk was a more physically advanced player at that stage. So, and same with Matty Beniers, who went second overall in his draft year. So to me, I think that James Higgins represents the best opportunity for teams to maybe hit a home run where everyone else is kind of like the trains are leaving the station on him. And I think that's way premature. My expectation is that James Higgins is going to be one of the best players in college hockey next year, and that's with an influx of talent from the CHL. I think he'll be a contender for the Hobey Baker. He is, of the guys that are being talked about in the top 10, the smallest, which I think plays a significant role in how he's being spoken about. I've seen a lot of things that say he's a perimeter player. He's not hard. I've watched him for 3 years. I've seen him get to the middle. I've seen him do things he's one of those players because, and this happens a lot with those NTDP guys, is that they're around NHL draft prospects for years before they're even eligible to be drafted. And so now I just feel like he's been completely picked apart. I think that that he is, for me, the smart that has the best hockey sense in this class. I also think he's probably the most skilled in terms of skating and hand skills, the best player in those categories. And normally that's a player that you'd say, well, they're going to go number one. But I just think the probabilities of James Higgins being a number one center isn't as great as the probability of Matthew Schaefer being a number one defenseman or Michael Misa being, a top of the lineup player, whether it's center or wing. He had the best draft season since Patrick Kane in the OHL in terms of production. So, I think that those are the things that stand out. But the guy that I've watched so much, and sometimes you get attached to players and you kind of feel you may overvalue them, and that may be the case for me. But it's just that the thing is I'm more confident in James Higgins being one of the 3 best players in this draft than I am about really anybody else. So that's the kind of thing that I feel is important to, state and also show in your rankings.
Well, I think Mike Cockatiel actually agrees with you. So it sounded like he was very on James Higgins train. For anyone listening, my bird likes to chime in every now and then. So anyway, but center is obviously a position that the Flyers are looking at, and even on Tuesday, Danny Brière and assistant general manager Brent Flair, they held their last pre-draft press conference before the draft on Friday. They talked a lot about center. And they also talked a little bit about how size maybe isn't something that they consider at number 6. It kind of leaned a little bit towards James Higgins. I guess, how would you rank? Obviously, I think we all know your answer here, but how do you rank the centers? Is James Higgins your number 1 center in this draft class?
I right now it's Misa. Misa is, and the question is will he ultimately be a center or will he be a wing? He wants to be a center. And I think you could probably have the same argument about James Higgins is how many 5'10" and a half centers are there in the NHL? Not a ton, but they exist, you think about Jack Hughes, you think about other players that are coming into the league, making an impact. Logan Cooley being another one in Utah. So I think that Higgins has followed a very similar path to those guys. So he'd be the number 2 guy after that, and then it would go to Frundell and then Desnoyers after that. And so then you kind of get into the mix of then it's Jake O'Brien, then it's Brady Martin, then it's Roger McQueen. So if you are looking for centers, this is a great year to be looking for it. I can't promise you that any one of those guys is going to be your number 1 center. I can say that they each have a ceiling projection of at least a number 2 center, which I think is hugely valuable in the NHL. And if you get that in your top 10, and that I think that's a good thing. I think you think about various guys that have gone in the draft. If you can get a number 1 center, amazing. If you can get a number 2 center, those are the guys that seem to be always in demand when trades come along. Everybody's, we need a number 2 center. So I do think that there's a number of options of players in this draft class that would be a really valuable number 2 center. But I do think that guys like Misa, Higgins, Frundell, those 3 in particular, I feel strongest about their ability to potentially be a number 1 center in the NHL. And then after that, really, like, I still think that there's a lot to be learned about Jake O'Brien. I think he's just scratching the surface of what he's going to be. Roger McQueen has the injury history, so you have to weigh that. I don't think that if I'm picking in the top 10, I'm probably not making that pick. I just out of a little bit of fear in terms of the overall upside and projection of him. He's got a tremendous upside. It's just the risk factor is much higher for him than it is for others with his injury history. And then you have a guy like Brady Martin, who I think has been getting into this discussion. And I love the player. I think he's a really good player. I think that some of the you're not going to be able to convince me that he's going to produce more at the NHL level than James Higgins, Michael Misa, the Anton Frundell. I mean, we're starting to hear Brady Martin could, is he going to be a top 5 pick? And like I said, love the player, love the character, love the way that he plays. But to me, that's not, that he's like at best a number 2 center, and possibly a number 3. And in some cases, there are some teams that say he might just be a wing in the end as well with the way that he plays. Like, go let him be an F1 of an assault missile winger that is going to lay the body and be more aggressive on the forecheck as opposed to some of the defensive responsibilities. But yeah, I mean, I look at guys like Desnoyers and they have this tremendous versatility. So the good news is if you are looking for centers and you're in that top 10, you've got a host of options. Some of them will be off the table by the time they get to you, but you've got really good options and you're in a range where I think you can land a player that's going to be, part of that foundation that you're building with Matvei Michkov and the others. And that is where I think that, you can make some significant headway, especially after last year. You have Jet Lutsenko,
right?
And his ceiling is definitely not number 1 center. It just doesn't feel like there's ever a world that's going to be true. But he is going to probably be in the middle of your lineup somewhere and be a very effective player. So you can swing for the fences a little bit here with this pick.
Well, that's the big question mark, right? I talked to all these guys at the scouting combine. We were both in Buffalo for the NHL scouting combine. And the question to them was, how do you think your game would work with Matvei Michkov? Of course, every single player was like, oh, great. We'll be great together. Yeah. But is there someone who you think is maybe a little bit more perfect for Matvei Michkov? Because let's be realistic here. They, in all likelihood, whoever they take, because they're probably leaning towards a center, could be, the Flyers do like to go off the board sometimes, as we saw with Lutsenko, because he was obviously ranked a little lower than where he was picked last year. But is there a center that you think fits best with a Matvei Michkov? Because I don't know if you need someone who is a passer with him, if that makes sense. He's
right. Yeah. What you need is not necessarily a passer, but you need somebody that is going to share the puck. And that, it's passing is ultimately sharing the puck, but it's more than that. It's can you have a play driver? Can you have somebody like, and I look at like Jake O'Brien is one of the guys that I think makes sense. He's a shot pass threat. He's a guy that I think can play away from the puck and be effective. I think that there's a lot of he's bigger too, like he's going to, as he gets stronger, I do think that, while I think James Higgins and Matvei Michkov would dissect defenses together, I think it's tough to have in the NHL align with 2 players like them in the same group. Now, the difference is that, James Higgins is one of the better skaters in this draft and adding that speed and processing speed. And the thing about Matvei is he processes the game at an elite level. Like, that's the thing that I've always thought is that there are some genius elements to his game in terms of his hockey sense and how he knows how to create offense. But you need somebody that is going to be comfortable off of the puck. And I think there were times this year where we saw James Higgins in particular playing with Gabe Perreault and Ryan Leonard at BC, where he was the third wheel, and you need him to take charge more. So that's been a very valid complaint about his game. But I think as I look at the way Michkov plays and the way that, these other guys, I think you want those types of players. The other guy that would potentially make sense, although I think his offensive upside is less than the others, is Desnoyers, because he will go get the puck. He will get you. He'll do the dirty work. and he'll play that physical game, which allows Matvey to be more of that kind of cerebral assassin where he's able to kind of float into space, get, somebody else is kind of doing the hard area elements of the game, and they're making him better as a result. So I do think that those guys, and I don't take Hagens off the table because of his ability to distribute, process the game. I think that they would figure out how to play with each other if it does come down to that. But you look at those guys, Desnoyers and O'Brien, and you say, wow, there's a lot of potential there for them to make Michkov more effective because of the style that they play.
That makes sense. I mean, I think Desnoyers is probably intriguing to the Flyers at minimum because of they know him, right?
Yes.
They know him because Elliot Desnoyers, and he was drafted by the Flyers. Granted, it was the Chuck Fletcher regime, but he was drafted by the team. He's been around the team. He skates with, obviously his brother Elliot Desnoyers in Montreal. He skates with Zade Wisdom. He's familiar to the organization.
Yeah, and I think that familiarity helps. I think also, in the end, the thing that's going to really win the day for Elliot, for Caleb, is that he is a winner. He is a guy that has won at multiple levels of hockey. He has done great things at the QMJHL level, but also internationally. He plays a style that is a winning. I think he plays a winning brand of hockey, where it's that hard driving, physically engaged battle and hunger for the puck that I think really will make him an effective pro. There is a lot left. What's that?
He did it with two.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he's a gamer too on top of it, right? So there's a lot to like about the player. And I think that the familiarity helps, but I certainly think that there's going to be a lot more to it in the end. But again, I think the way that he plays there's a reason that we're talking about a player who might have a little bit less upside offensively than some of these other guys, that we're talking about him as a potential top 5 pick because of the versatility in his game. He impacts the game in so many different ways, and is probably the most complete center and the most likely to play center among these guys that are kind of, that are on the outside of the top 2. So that's encouraging as well.
And when I talked to him in Buffalo, he said that the last time he lost like a championship game, he lost in the semifinals of the Memorial Cup to London, but his Moncton team did. But the last time that kind of thing happened, he won 4 championships in a row. So yeah, you can tell there's like a little bit of a competitive edge with him, I think.
For sure.
So obviously we have Matthew Schaefer, who is expected to be number 1 by the New York Islanders. Michael Misa is the expected number 2 to San Jose. But the Flyers were one of 13 to 14 teams who actually did interview Misa in Buffalo. Let's get a little crazy, Chris. Are we going to see some trades on Friday night?
I think there's a possibility. I think a team would have to be super aggressive if they were desperate for Misa. I think that the likely scenario at this point is you draft. If Schaefer goes 1, Misa's going to go 2 to San Jose. I'm intrigued to see what's going to happen with the number 4 pick. Utah wants to be aggressive. I think if Utah is going to move that pick, I think it's going to have to be for an impactful roster player, as opposed to them just trading back and getting additional assets. I don't think that's their interest. But like if they have a guy that they like that they think they could get a little bit later, maybe they do move back. But I think it's unlikely. It's the prices for top 10 picks are often astronomical, and they're often really not based in reality. I mean, they're just like, and so a lot of those deals never happen because they're really like I think that often the pick value can be overinflated, especially in a year where there's so much uncertainty. So if a team feels less strong about the top 10 than say another team outside of it does, and they're willing to make the move, then I think it's possible. But it seems like it would take an awful lot for any of the teams to move from where they are right now. But I do think that Misa is one of those guys that teams feel strongly enough about where they could potentially try to move up and get him. But I think most teams in the situation that they're in right now are happy with where they're at. And I doubt we'll see a ton of movement, but I'm not saying it won't happen just in case I do think Utah is a bit of a wild card in this whole scenario.
Well, Danny Brière did say at the end of season or the pre-draft press conference that, he's had conversations about moving up, but nothing's really going on right now, waiting on phone calls kind of thing, which I think we all seen. It picks up that week of the draft when all of a sudden it's like, oh, the timer's starting to go. Like, we have to make these moves coming up pretty quick. And you mentioned Brady Martin, and he definitely had created a lot of buzz around Buffalo at the scouting combine. Yeah. He's got a great background, a great, this is as a person who he is. What do you think of his value as a player? And what do you think of him as a player, I should say, and his value? And why is his rise happening? Is it warranted?
I think the rise is multifold. He had a great under-18 world championship, which helps, and Canada won gold, and it wasn't a good U18 worlds. I haven't put a ton of stock into the production and the different things because I think that that Canada team was exceptional and basically just did what we thought they would do. What I do think is partially behind the rise is I think that Brady Martin as a player and as a person has enamored teams because of he is an incredible body checker. He's played, and every team that he has played knows they played Brady Martin because he will leave a mark. And I think that that's a good thing. I think it's as we see in the playoffs, that matters. And the reason, every time we get to the playoffs and we get to a situation where it's we need to build a team that can win the Stanley Cup. And how do we do that? We have to find playoff players in the draft. I think there's a lot of ways to find playoff players. I think you got to pick the player that you think is going to be the best NHL player, regardless of the time of year, is who you have to pick. And then you have to allow that player to develop into whatever they're going to be. I think Brady Martin is one of those guys where you don't have to coax it out of him. He's just going to be that. And he's going to be a guy. And I think teams like that. And so when you see the Florida Panthers play their abrasive style and physical style and get under their opponent's skin, you're like, sign me up. I want more of that. And so I think that's a big piece of the rise. But as I mentioned, the person is also a part of it. He born and raised in a farm situation. He's not going to LA because he's going to be working on the family farm. And, that again, I think if it was an in-person draft, he probably would have gone, but because none of the teams are there, he's like, I got other things to do. And I think he's not going because he's not interested. He's not going because he's busy, so it's kind of like one of those things where I think teams are kind of enamored with that. I heard the interview process for him was excellent during the combine. And so as teams got to know him and know what he was about, they wanted to be part of that. I think he's an identity player. Teams are always searching for identity. This is a guy that's going to help your team create some identity because of the work ethic, because of the competitiveness. And then on top of it, we talk about the physicality, but he is a skilled player. There is a lot of talent in that. He doesn't have the offensive upside of a James Higgins or a Porter Martone or a Jake O'Brien, but he has those other elements that will help. And then he's not inept offensively. If he was an inept offensively, this would be a guy that would be picked in the 4th, 5th round. But he's not. He's very good in that regard. So I think it's warranted. I do pause when I start hearing top 5 or higher, yeah. I mean, I think if the guys, I just have a hard time putting and my own list, on my own list, Brady Martin is 9th. And that's, that was at that point I was like, I just think he's going to play, and I think he's going to play for a long time. but I don't think he's going to impact the game offensively in the same way as some of those other guys will. And so that to me is where I draw, like, when we talked about who would be great to play with Matvei Michkov, I didn't say Brady Martin. And that's, I'm not, maybe it would work. It could, like, it's like a oil and water kind of situation, but like, I think it could, it could work. But just, I have more faith in the guys that have a little bit more of that offensive refinement in their game. So he's an interesting player nonetheless. Like, I think if he goes 6 to 10, I don't think the gap between him and those guys is at all significant. So, I think that the gap among really the guys that go, I think 3 to 10 is pretty small.
Yeah, when I did speak with him on the phone recently, he was sitting outside a cow auction. So that tells you who Brady Martin is. And he's very blue collar, which I think fits very well with Philadelphia as well.
And I mean, the thing is, he is blue collar. Like that their farm, from what I understand, does very well. So, like, that's the thing. He's maintained a work ethic despite definitely, like, this business providing opportunities for his family that, not everybody's going to have to train, to do the things that he needs to do. But yeah, he's a really remarkable individual.
Oh yeah. He already said his goal after his hockey career is to just take over the farm. So that tells you a lot about who he is. And he's one of the players who met with the Flyers for dinner, a nice steak dinner from my understanding they had. And another player was Jake O'Brien. He had chicken, he said. So not as nice as the steak place maybe, but
good healthy option.
Yeah, there's a couple good places. But I mean, there's a lot of talk about Jake O'Brien going at 6, especially if a Higgins is gone, especially if a Desnoyers is gone.
Yeah.
What is it about him that makes him maybe a good option at 6? And what do you think of his game?
I mean, I think among the players that will be available there, he's going to be one of the most skilled. It's like, between him, if Higgins is still there, I'd lean Higgins, but really you look at the skill level. He's a legitimate pass shot threat, which I think is so important to have a guy that, can make plays. And it's really part of what we've learned about Michkov as well, is that, yes, he is a sniper, but boy, can he make plays. And that's kind of what Jake O'Brien can do as well. He does it in a 6'2" frame that has a lot of room to fill out. And as he gets stronger, he'll be more powerful, better to, tougher to play against, but he's got a real processor for the game. He sees the ice incredibly well. He makes great reads. He's got good hands to execute plays. He makes players better. He allows players to make him better too, like, which I think is maybe something we don't talk about a lot, in just like, you have to, like when I talked about, you have to be able to share the puck. You have, he could play with elite players in the OHL or elite level OHL players and make them better, and they would make him better. So I think it was, it kind of swings both ways in that regard.
And they do have a connection there too, because Jamie Key, who is the head coach in Brantford, is was teammates with Danny Brière in Buffalo. There's obviously been a lot of talk about Jamie Key coming to Lehigh Valley because now there's an opening there, but obviously he recently re-signed with the Bulldogs, so he will not be coming. But I'm sure their phone conversations have been obviously centered around Jake O'Brien these days.
Yeah.
I mean, another guy you mentioned a little bit was Roger McQueen. He has, he had an injury to his back. He did when I spoke with him, he did say that he actually did a medical interview with the staff of the Flyers who were in Buffalo to kind of gauge where he was with his injury recovery. He did all the tests at the combine. What is it about him? Do we think there's a little risk and reward there. Do we think he's someone at 6 that do we think he's someone who could potentially be picked up at 6?
I think on the upside, yes. Like, like in terms of, if in a perfect world, he might have gone as high as 1, really. I mean, like, if he's healthy enough, like a 6'5" player, good skater, high-end skill, good hockey sense, to be all of that in that package is huge. There are 2 things that go against them. One is the injury, but 2 is that Caden Lindstrom had an injury last year, did the same thing at the combine. I'm fine. Everything's fine. It's going great. I'm ready to go. Didn't participate in all of the combine things. He also didn't play all this year until the Memorial Cup. He missed the entire season. And so it's always, I've said this all year about Roger. I'm sorry to him. If he listens, because I've said it so many times, it is great to be big unless you have a back injury. Yeah. There are so many there because of the size, because of the way that you carry your weight, because of the way that you move. The back injury in particular is going to give teams a lot of pause. Roger did everything he could to convince people that he's fine. The risk still exists. Right. Whether like, even if you are fully medically cleared, as far as the teams are concerned, the risk is still there in picking this player.
Right.
The reward, however,
it doesn't help him that he had Caden, who is a
right. Like, that's the biggest thing is if Lindstrom went 4th overall last year, despite all of the concerns. And McQueen may actually be the better of the two players. So what I'll say is that the risk is high, but the reward has great potential to be high as well. To get a 6'5" center with that capability, with that skill level, with what he can do when healthy, it's tantalizing. You look at what Tage Thompson has become for the Buffalo Sabres. You look at, think about other 6'5" guys, Blake Wheeler, other players. They have made a significant impact when they have the skill to go with it. And that's what Roger McQueen has. And that's why I think teams are going to still consider him, even with the risk in there, because the teams that feel like they have the capability to swing for the fences may pick him as a result. But from what I can gather, there is still fear. And so that's where, and I think it has to be when you're picking, you can't, those are the picks. If you pick the player and he gets hurt and he never gets better,
right,
that you lose your job, right. So that's basically where it goes.
So there's like two-fold things here with the Flyers, right? They know Marty Murray. He's a former Flyer, and he's also, they have Carson Bjarnason in Brandon also. So they have connection to the organization. They probably have more intel than probably any other team out there about Roger McQueen. And I recently spoke to Marty Murray. He does, he says he's healthy, he's good to go, kind of thing. But obviously there is the risk, because also the Flyers has Sean Couturier with his back issues. And so the question is, do you want to go down that route if you have a player that maybe can't play? So it'll be interesting to see what happens with there. But we've talked a lot about centers. There's also a winger that is very highly listed here.
Yes.
A surefire winger. We know he's not going to play center ever. Porter Martone is someone who is intriguing. He could be he's a big guy, big winger, high-end talent. Could this be the guy the Flyers go for? Because we all know they don't necessarily always stay on the board with whatever, and they don't follow the general consensus on a pick. Yeah,
and you know what I think, like, there were stretches of this season where Porter Martone was in the number 1 discussion, was in the number 2 discussion, so, and there's reason for it. He's a 6'3" strong winger with excellent vision and playmaking ability and hand skills and scoring ability, like all those things. He's got all that stuff. And when you have that plus size, it's great. I think that there are two things that kind of go against Porter and why I'm not 100% convinced that like the Flyers are going to be a team that goes after him. The pace of play is a little bit behind some of these other guys. Like, he's not a very quick player. The skating is fair. It's not bad. Like, I don't want to say it's bad. It's just when you look at guys like the others that we're talking about, most of them are better skaters than he is. So okay. That's part of it. The other thing too with Porter, I think, is if you are drafting him to be a hard-nosed power winger, you probably aren't getting that player. Like, he is a skilled, productive player. when he flips the switch and he can get a little mean, I think that's when he plays his best. He just doesn't do it all the time. And because of that, I think you look at teams that would potentially be in a range to pick a player like him, like Chicago. Like his player profile doesn't fit the way that they've drafted the last several years.
Right.
Utah, similar thing. But he does have the size component. And I still think he is an option at number 4 for them. But I think for Porter, it's all about finding that level of consistency where your motor's always running, your hard-nosed nature is there, but you don't lose what makes you a special player, and that is the skill, the hockey sense, the vision. And he is an excellent player. And he's a guy, I didn't mention him, but there is a lot of, I think there could be a lot of opportunity for whoever ends up between him and Matvei Michkov, if that's the option, because you could potentially, flip the wings, whatever you got to do, whatever you got to do to put him in the right places. But, I think that there are options there. Like basically the other thing too is in the modern NHL, sometimes the wings are interchangeable. Sometimes even the centers are interchangeable. I mean, a lot of wings take faceoffs, a lot of, there's different responsibilities like that's the thing that I've always kind of been hung up on. Like the reason centers go high is because they're typically the most versatile and they're easier to move to wing. It's harder to move a wing to center, all those things. But I think in the modern NHL, odds are you're going to be playing all 3 forward positions over the course of even a single game, or maybe even a shift, depending on what the roles are. But yeah, so I really think that for Martone, he belongs in the discussion starting at 3 all the way down to wherever he ends up going. And he's been one where
too, so as long as he's this season alone, right? He's, Matvei Michkov is a left shot right wing, but he's played left side too with Konechny because their pairing worked. So he decided he was going to take the left side. Yeah. He's also a right wing. So it's interesting with that because you do see that a lot. And I think that's a fair assessment. I mean, look at, he's not on the team anymore, but Scott Lawton was also a center, right? Center and a wing. He could play both. He could do both sides. He was that kind of thing. So it does seem like the Flyers tend to go off the board a little bit with their picks. As we mentioned earlier, Jetlachenko was someone that they picked last year that a lot of people had much deeper in the draft, or in the first round, but still later in the draft. Brent Flair did mention at his press conference that, there's a bunch of centers, there's a bunch of wingers, there's 2 defensemen. Obviously, I think we know that those are, Radim Martika and Keishon Atchison. I think that's a fair assessment, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, could you see them potentially taking them at 6, or is that too much of a risk there, or too high of a mark for those kind of players?
I don't think it is. I mean, I think if you believe either one of those guys has the potential to be a top pairing or top 4 defenseman, there's so much value there. I think when it's close, you're usually going to lean center. There's just a better opportunity for impact. I think there's a better development timeline. The thing is like we've got Murtka, who might have some of the best upside of any player in this draft. He's 6'6". He's got mobility. The one thing is we want to see him play meaner at his size. One thing he said at the combine was that, I was always getting penalties because I was bigger than everybody. So I kind of stopped playing physically to avoid penalties and lost that little bit. So I got to get that back, and I was like, oh, that's true. But also you kind of got to have that. So, but there's a lot of love there for the player because of the size, the mobility, and the potential. Then you've got Keishon Atchison, who is, 6'1", but just a heat-seeking missile. Like, I mean, he is absolutely, he hits everything. He looks like a Flyer, like an old school Flyer in terms of that aggression that he plays with. And then he had 26 goals this year. Now, I don't think a defenseman that scored 26 goals in the OHL and plays the way that he plays is going to score consistently in the NHL. But that he did it in junior is a great sign for where his game is headed. I think he does have good offensive capabilities. He moves pucks well, but it's that edge that he plays with. It's the way he closes gaps. It's the way he finishes plays. It's the way that he kills plays for the other team. He is definitely a guy that I think could go fairly high, maybe higher than expected. You can't rule out the defensemen because I think, like I said, we're talking about guys that more than likely are going to be number 2 centers.
Right.
But if you think that you could have a top pairing or number 3 defenseman, in some cases that may be more valuable to your team. So I would not rule either of them out. They are very unique and they are both intriguing. I consider them in that group of 12 to 13 players where I think the talent of this draft lies. So again, it's another one of those where I don't think the gap is so far between, let's say, Jake O'Brien and Keishon Aitchison and Radim Murka that you would just say dismiss that out of hand. It's not as exciting to draft a defenseman at number 6 unless he's got some of that really pure scoring ability and looks like a surefire top 4. But I think with both those players, there's also the risk that comes with drafting a defenseman that you have to then develop and kind of see when you have some of these centers that just kind of seem ready-made.
Yeah, no, I mean, Keishon definitely, he does seem like a flyer. When you speak with him, he loves the open ice hits.
Yes.
He loves hitting people. He loves being a gritty defenseman, not to use the word, but a gritty defenseman. So it's an interesting take. And of course, obviously, like I said, Brent Flair mentioned specifically the centers, said there was maybe 1 or 2 high wingers, and then he did mention the 2 defensemen. There was also the question that was raised to him about goalies, and the Flyers do have, aside from number 6, which we spend a lot of time on because rightfully so, but they also have 22, and they also have now that we know, because with the Edmonton Oilers losing in the Stanley Cup final, they have number 31. Could they take a goalie with one of those spots? And if so, who are we thinking here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's potential. I think there is potential for a goalie to be among those picks. I think when you're a team that has multiple first-round picks, you're emboldened a little bit to maybe take a swing. We've seen that with a lot of teams. Sometimes they'll use that last pick as like their off-the-board pick, and in some cases it works great. In other cases, it doesn't work at all. But, and I think I could, to bring another name up, you think about when Flyers had multiple picks and they got Joel Farabee and then Jay O'Brien. And that
we don't mention Jay O'Brien's name around here either.
Yeah. So like, you can swing and miss too, right? So what I would say is that while I believe that a goalie will go in the first round, I don't know that there should be a goalie that goes in the first round. Joshua Ravensburgen has been the guy all year. His numbers weren't great this year. He didn't play particularly well, but he does have NHL tools.
Right.
And what I would say in that scenario is this is how I ended up getting him on my list, I believe at number 26. If you believe that there's any potential for that player to be a number 1 goalie, and then the rest of the players you're talking about are bottom 6 and bottom 6 forwards, bottom pairing defensemen, because that's where I think we're getting to in those ranges. Right. I don't think we're getting to highly projectable top 6 guys. There are guys that have potential. But if you believe there's any chance that a Ravensburgen could be a number 1 goalie in the NHL, then that's a swing worth taking, because that is going to be a more valuable piece long term. What I think you have to do when you do pick any goalie in this draft is you have to prepare for the long haul. He's not going to be ready for 4 or 5 years.
Right. Which works well for the Flyers, right? Because you have Bjarnason, you have Zvragin in the system.
Yeah, you hope any one of those guys work out. But again, with goalies, it's such a difficult thing, and that's why I think that it's hard to pick a goalie in the first round, is because there are so many variables.
Right.
Sometimes you get Andrei Vasilevsky, sometimes you get Mark Vicentine. It's just kind of these are the things that happen in these drafts. So like there are definitely risks there, but when you've insulated yourself with multiple picks, and I also think like maybe 31 is an opportunity to trade down, get more second rounders or something like that. There are a lot of opportunities with 3 picks in the first round that you can maximize your value that way. And I think that if you did take 31, and if there's a goalie you love in that group, keep 31 and take the goalie.
Right.
If there isn't, either trade back, use that pick on something else. Maybe you take a swing on a higher upside forward or a guy that, just kind of fits what you're doing. Those kinds of things are helpful. So I think it's at least a discussion. But I do think that there's a lot of risk. Not a great year for goalies.
Right.
And the fact that we are talking about Ravensburgen as a potential first rounder is another kind of indictment on the class as a whole, where it's like there just aren't enough good players that we feel we can project into a high lineup area and that's ultimately what happened with me putting Ravensburgen as high as I did. I didn't want to put him in the first round, but I'm also like, of the guys that we're talking about, he feels like the one that has the best chance to be a number one goalie. So, so it's a hard thing to figure out for sure.
Well, there's, the Flyers do have 22 and 32. Who do you think is going to be the guys maybe they take at those spots? Because it sounds like, with our mock draft, we've been going defenseman at 22. But I have a feeling that there's a good chance they might move up to take a defenseman because of the Logan Henslers and the, maybe Atchison falls down to that level. I don't think he will, but maybe he falls down. Maybe there's a big fiddler. I mean, who do you think they're going to potentially go to at 22? And now that we know it's also 31.
Yeah. So, I definitely think that in that 22 range, you probably will find something that you like among the defensemen. It would be in that next tier of defensemen,
right?
Like the Cam Reed, Logan Hensler, Sasha Boumediene, Blake Fiddler, all of those guys that are kind of in that mix. So I do think that picking one of those guys would make sense. If they're available. We'll see when the run on defensemen starts, because I do think that it really does thin out significantly after the guys that I just mentioned. I don't think I have another defenseman on my list until, the mid 30s at that point. Although Henry Bustevich is another one that I think is in the mix. I just don't have him as high, but he is a guy that I think is in the mix to be, picked in that whole,
which makes sense.
Round.
Which makes sense for the Flyers because obviously they know London very well with Denver Barkey and Oliver Bonk. He's a London product too. So
yes, yeah. So I mean, I think that there's a lot of good options in that 22 range that'll be left among the defensemen unless there's a real run, in the teens, and suddenly you're like, oh, there's nobody left. I think that if you are. For the Flyers, I think given what they have on their blue line, Cam York, Jamie Drysdale, I think, it helps to try and find some bigger guys. Blake Fiddler fits that mold. Logan Hensler fits that mold. Both of them are going to be more of your defensive variety player. They can move pucks just fine. They can produce a little bit here and there. I think Hensler is probably still figuring out his offensive game a little bit. I like the player a lot. I think his athletic profile is tremendous, and he's an excellent skater. So there's a lot to like. But yeah, I mean, when we're talking about these guys in the 20s, there's a lot of flaws to these players as well. I think a lot of the guys in this range, hockey sense is okay, and maybe their offensive upside isn't as great. Or Sasha Boumediene is a guy who's like one of the best skaters in the draft. Yet, he didn't. What is he ultimately going to be as an NHL player? It's kind of hard to predict. So. I do think that those are real options there. Guys kind of towards the tail end of the draft and tail end of the first round to just kind of be aware of, keep an eye on. Some of the American players, Will Horkoff, University of Michigan, I think he may end up going higher than 31, which, would potentially leave some options there. Cole McKinney is a really good two-way center that I think, he was on a pretty poor US under 18 team, but has a lot of the kind of the talent that you need to be a middle six center. that I think would be a great find at that range of the draft. If you're thinking about guys to maybe take a bigger swing on, Simon Wang from Oshawa Generals, played for the King Rebellion, 6'6" defenseman, born in China. I think he's probably going to go earlier second round. He doesn't necessarily have the edge that you would want in a big defenseman, which is why I think he's going to slip out of the first round. He also really struggled with the transition going from the OJHL to the OHL in terms of finding his offensive game. So I think there are some, it'd be tough to pick that player in that range. But if you're like, let's bet on upside and see if we can get in there. He just has a unique skill set because of his size and his mobility. There are a lot of options that are available there that I think are intriguing. And then the other thing too is I do think the option of potentially trading back from 31, getting maybe an extra second round pick or a second and a third, depending on how you're feeling, could potentially be beneficial as well.
Which we saw them do last year, which is how they ended up with 31 this year. They made the trade last year with the Oilers, but the Flyers do have 4 picks in the second round. They have 36, they have 48. They have 7 picks in the top 48. And there's, second round, Brent Flair did say that he does see the second round being stronger than maybe some people think. He thinks it's not as bad, but then it does fall off. So there's probably a good probability that they go with all 4.
Yeah, I think part of the reason the second round is better than people think is that it starts in like the 20s this year. Like that's because I agree. As I'm putting the list together, I was like, there are enough, like the way I put it in my piece for the draft is there are a ton of guys that are really easy to like. There just aren't as many that are easy to love, so like, that's kind of where it is. And this is the other thing too, that I think is unique about this draft. The size of the draft. There are so many big dudes in this draft, 6'4" and taller, and a lot of them are forwards. Like you got Mason West, a senior. You'll be a senior in high school next year. He's 6'6", over 6'6", and 215 pounds already. So there are a lot of guys like that. Jacob Rombach, 6'6" defenseman. Simon Wang, 6'6" defenseman. There are so many players. And so if you are seeking size, you can find it. Whether or not those players will also be great NHL players it remains to be seen, but there's a lot to be found there.
And it's fair to say Mason West is probably someone Flyers fans should keep an eye on. He's an interesting.
I think so.
He's an interesting take with he's a football player. I think he was planning on playing quarterback for his high school.
He's going to play quarterback for one more season. Then he says that he's going to stick with hockey. So he'll go to the Fargo Force after he's done with his football season.
We'll see.
NHL teams, however, are not 100% there in believing that because they say, what if the University of Michigan really likes you and they offer you a full scholarship? And you're going to say no? Especially now in the NIL era when they can offer you 6 figures and, all that other stuff. So it'll be interesting to watch that. There are teams that are monitoring that. I think it's more likely that Mason West goes early in the second round as opposed to a team using a first-round pick, unless that team is the Flyers with a third first-rounder. The upside on that kid is immense. I think a lot of people wonder when he focuses solely on hockey, how high is he going to be able to take it? Because he's 6'6" and he can skate. He does feel like it could be Tage Thompson. There's a lot there in terms of what he can be as a player.
A lesson to parents. Do 2 sports at least, minimum.
Yes, exactly. All the way, as long as you can, as long as it's fun.
All right, let's do some rapid fire questions based on this draft. All right. Who is one player that could go a lot higher than expected and one that you think will slide?
I think a player that could go higher than expected. And this is tough because I think it's tough because in this draft, it's hard to say that anything is truly unexpected because I just think that most of it is unexpected at this point. A name to kind of keep an eye on, I think Shane Van Sage from Michigan State. Chance he could sneak into the first round. He is a bottom 6 player, I think, at the NHL level, but he is a high floor player where you know what you're going to get. He's strong. He's physical. He can pop in the odd point. I think he's, got a chance to win a national championship with Michigan State this year and will be a big part of that. That's a name to keep an eye on. A guy that could go a lot lower, a guy that I expect to go a lot lower, and a guy that I think is going to be on a lot of teams don't draft lists is Ivan Rabkin from the Muskegon Lumberjacks. He had a terrible combine. Fitness levels are questionable. He is an elite, not elite. He's a very good offensive performer. He can shoot the puck. But really, I think there are a lot of concerns about that player. I think he could go deeper into the 3rd, 4th, 5th round. I think that there are just going to be teams that pass entirely. And that's a guy that we talked about coming into this season as a potential top 5 pick in this draft. So that's quite a tumble.
I did hear the similar things about him, and especially being out of shape. And from what I've heard, someone made a comment that he was out of shape all season. So that's interesting.
He was, and really that was when he came over from Russia. Throughout the entire season, the Russian coaches were in the press, just taking him out, criticizing his work ethic, his physical fitness, all of those things. He comes to Muskegon, and they surround him with talent. He wins a championship, I think. But the other thing about him that I find interesting is he's kind of crazy, on the ice. He is very aggressive. He takes a lot of dumb penalties as a result. So I think that him coming to North America was good for him to get away from the situation that he was in.
Right.
But it was bad for him because now everybody saw what the coaches were talking about. So I think there are going to be a good number of teams that pass entirely. And I think that, the watch for me for Rabkin, I think really starts in the end of the 3rd round and maybe even lower.
I agree with you on that. And I will say I still have Shane Van Saggy as my number 30, now 31 pick, but I do think the Flyers can get him at 36. I spoke with him at the combine, oozes Flyers.
He's
flyer. You just get that, he has that grittiness. Yeah. I do think he's maybe the next, not no disrespect to Garnett Hathaway, but he could be the guy in a couple of years that fills his shoes. And they have seen a lot of Shane Van Saggy at Michigan State because they did sign Carson Dorwart. So they knew this kid. So I'm intrigued by him too.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Who is a player outside the top 10 that people are not talking enough about?
It's a good question. Outside of the top 10, I think a guy that I'm really intrigued by is Justin Carbonneau. He's right outside the top 10. It's not like he's very far out of it. But, I think his combination of power and skill, he's not as big as a Porter Martone, but he's harder. He plays the game harder. And I think he's got real scoring ability. There's talk of him going to college next year. That when I heard that one of the schools was Boston College, to me it sounded like an instant replacement for Ryan Leonard. Plays a very similar style to Ryan Leonard with that abrasive, get to the interior, get to the net hard. So I like that player a lot. I think he's a guy that he's kind of when I say I'm talking when the top 12 or 13, he's usually the number 13 that I'm talking about.
So not too far down in the in the draft. I think I'm going to say I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Who is a player you enjoyed watching the most in this draft?
Player I enjoyed watching the most. Man, that is actually what's that?
You can say James Higgins. It sounds like you've seen him.
I would say I would say James Higgins, although I think that I wanted more from him this year too. I get why people were kind of down on him a little bit. But yeah, honestly, it's kind of funny. I know this sounds bad. But I actually didn't have a lot of fun watching hockey this year, just because, you look at kind of some of the guys that we've had to track these last few years, and it wasn't as enjoyable. But I will say, like, I do think like my kind of like Caleb Desnoyers is my kind of player. Like he just is, and I think that there are players because of players with a little bit more offensive upside. I had him, a little bit lower maybe than some of these other guys. And the thing is, I just think that he plays the game the right way. He does so many things. There's so many good details to his game. The fact that he played through injury and was the QMJHL MVP was unbelievable. So I'm really excited to watch him as he progresses, because I think that as he gets healthy and everything, like I think he'll be a big part of Team Canada at the World Juniors next year. I think he's going to be a guy, assuming that his injury recovery doesn't take too long.
Right.
But there's a lot I like about the player.
All right. We all know that, the guys sit around the table and there's a lot of yelling and shouting at some point because they want their player drafted in the mid rounds. Who are you banging the table for in the mid rounds?
Man. I think for me, a guy that I would like to see drafted, I have him higher on my list than I think he's going to go. But I like the player. I like the mentality. I like where his game is going. And that'd be Ben Keevan from the Des Moines Buccaneers. Ben is a kid that we actually tracked at the beginning of the season. We did a little mini doc with the Bucs at the Fall Classic on FloHockey. And, he has some electric skill to him. His great hands. He scored a couple of highlight reel goals this year. Really good release. He's a little bit slighter, and he needs to get to the interior more. He needs to be a little bit more competitive and needs to get stronger, which he will do at school. He's going to Arizona State. He scored the game-winning goal for the bronze medal game for Team USA in overtime at the U18 Worlds, and that was a kid from outside of their program that they brought in, and he seamlessly kind of got into that group, and they were able to kind of bring him in. And so he's a guy like in the middle rounds. Like I have him in as a second round rated prospect. I don't think he's going to go in the second round. I think he'll probably go in the third, but that's a guy where as the picks are starting to tick off, I'm like, hey, because the one thing I wrote in my report that's on FloHockey too, is that it's hard for me to really put my finger on it, but I've definitely gotten some like Jake Gensel vibes from him. Ooh. Like in terms of Jake Gensel was completely underappreciated because he was smaller, but he was incredibly skilled, very productive. He was more productive in the USHL than Keevan was this year, but he was always a player that to me, if like that same player was in one of the Canadian major junior leagues, they may have bumped up a couple spots because they did it at that level. And those players seem to get a little bit more of the benefit of the doubt than those from the USHL. But I really like Ben Keevan. So yeah, that's probably the guy for me for the mid rounds.
All right, I don't want to keep you too long, so I'm going to give you a quick topic and just give me a name. You ready?
Yep.
Right. The best skater in the draft.
Cullen Potter,
who we've had on our first mock draft, also for the Flyers. At the time, we thought it was 32, but now it's 31. Best goal scorer.
I think it's probably Anton Frundell, even though the numbers might not say that at the moment. But I think that he's the best goal scorer.
Best shot.
Frundell.
Wow, that's two for Frundell. All right. Best playmaker.
Hagens.
Best defender. Or defenseman.
Yeah. I would say like overall defensive capability, I'd say Schaefer.
Schaefer. He is the number one pick for a reason, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Who would you say is the smartest player in the draft?
I'd say Hagens.
Is he also the best or the best hockey IQ?
Yeah, I'd say it's between Hagens and Schaefer on that one.
Okay. What is your biggest draft hot take?
That
you can go with a little bit more there.
Yeah, the biggest draft hot take is that a goalie shouldn't go in the first round, but will. Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I think for this year, because of the lack of certainty, it's hard to have like a really decisive take on it because there are so many things that I'm like, yeah, I can see that. That makes sense. You can make arguments for so many things on this draft. You can make the argument that a guy that played 17 games this year is the number one pick. Like that's kind of where we're at. So
yeah.
I will say the other hot take that I have that is that the risk factor with Matthew Schaefer is higher than anyone wants to admit.
Ooh, I haven't heard that one. That is definitely a hot take.
Yeah,
all right.
That's what I would say. Yeah.
I'm going to put you on the spot, Chris. One last one. Who are the Flyers taking at number 6?
I mean, I think it's very likely to be Jake O'Brien. I would say that would be the guy that just feels like the fit. And the reason I say that is I think there's a lot to his game. I think he has the size profile. You think about, obviously I think he is going to be able to do a lot of the things that Cutter Gauthier was drafted to do. Another name that we're not allowed to bring up on the podcast. But I think that, if Hagens is there, like obviously everybody knows I would take Hagens. But because of the Mitch Cobb factor and other things, I think like having a guy like O'Brien is a real good stylistic fit. Now, the reason I'm also saying that is that I don't think like Desnoyers, like I'm not sure he's going to be there, so that's part of it. Right.
So you're saying we don't know. We don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, yeah, like we don't know. Like, I think I know where the first 3 picks are going to go. I don't think I know anything after that, really. And I really can't say with certainty that 2-3 are going to absolutely be what I think it's going to be. You
also had James Hagens at number 1 too, though. So
I did at one time, yeah, at one time, and that there will be a new mock draft coming out with that. But yeah, I mean, like that's the other thing is like the Islanders have this strange thing. There is a campaign to get James Hagens picked, but I think fans are like, okay, well, just pick whoever, and we'll trust you, because that's what fans do. But yeah. So I think there's a lot of intrigue.
Yeah.
But like, I think if you were to ask me what the most likely scenario is, it's probably Jake O'Brien there. But yeah, I think there's a lot of uncertainty in those next picks right before the Flyers are going to go that it really could go anyway.
Yeah, we could have another Bennett Seneke bad words said on TV thing.
Yeah.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for being the first ever guest on the Flyers edition of Inquirer Live at Gameday Central. Really appreciate you taking the time all the way from the West Coast.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jackie.
Thanks so much.